Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us from places near and far uh, to Source Booksellers um, special time uh, on in this special time. We have pivoted to online sales and to holding virtual events. And this is our very first in a series of Friday evening dates. I was told a long time ago that don't ever put anything on Friday nights because that's date night. So this is a date with us tonight. So this is our time to offer to our beloved customers and our beloved Detroit community bookish literary talks via Skype and YouTube. Thank you so much for helping us get on our feet and get wet in this new environment. We also want to wish all of you and your families health and wellness now and on into the future, far past this pandemic. Today is International Workers' Day, and it's a really good day, May Day, May 1st, to sorry, to talk about this particular book. It's also the day that this book is being launched um, by the Duke University Press in North Carolina. And we want to really thank them for being so good about getting books to us this very day, the day the book was released, to have this book talk with our authors in California. Now, if that's not magic, I don't know what is. So this is our 21st century magic. This book in particular is an excellent book to have today because it talks about Detroit. It talks about this history of Detroit, and what better book could we have for today? Our authors, Mark J. and Philip Conklin, have written a book according to Cedric um, Cedric Johnson's uh, review that Tim Giles. Oh my gosh, that they have written a stimulating, bold, and panoramic treatment of Detroit. The book is entitled "A People's History of Detroit." And I have to always think about Howard Zinn, who happened to have been one of my history teachers at Spelman College. I was far along
Oh,
when he got to Spelman, but he has written, of course, as you know, the People's History of the United States and the other books, many other books that he wrote. So our guest authors today are from two places in California. So once again, we are really breaking the bounds of space and time by doing this tonight. So Mark J, raise your hand, Mark. There he is. Mark,
hello.
Mark
Thanks for
J
having us.
uh-huh, is a candidate, PhD candidate in sociology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And Philip Conklin is a student in the history of consciousness at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And when I think about these universities in California, I have to remember how forward thinking and forward acting California was at one time and still today of having a university system. And at that long time ago, it was free. And
Hmm.
so I hope that we can kind of bring that from the past and up on into the future. Now, for our wonderful people who have, oh, and by the way, they are co editors of the literary political magazine entitled The Periphery. So, just a bit of housekeeping now before we dive in. Questions can be put into the chat, and we will monitor and feed them to our guests. For those of you who are in our virtual audience, okay, they're still adjusting. You can tell, right? Okay, is that better? All right. Also, books are for sale on our online website that you will be able to see on the screen. It's online, um, Source Booksellers Online .com. For those of you who have pre-ordered books by way of even Eventbrite, your book is arrived today. We packaged up as many as we could, and they're being sent along to you in your home. And you should have them very soon. So let's begin.
Oh no. Hold on. 1 second. Can you help? Okay, they are.
Okay,
It's just the two of them.
I think we're back. Okay. So let's begin. Mark, if I may say Mark, and Philip. I'm Janet, by the way.
Yeah.
And, tell us, what brought you to the idea of writing this book of Detroit history? And how did it happen that the two of you came to collaborate? Let's start with you, Mark.
Um, how did we come to collaborate? We went to University of Michigan, and Phil's partner and I and my partner took a class at University of Michigan that was run by an organization called the Prison Creative Arts Project, and that kind of talks about social justice issues and then sends facilitators in to run poetry or theater workshops in prisons or juvenile detention centers or high schools in Detroit. Um, and then we kind of got politicized through that and then moved to Detroit. We started this literary magazine that you mentioned, The Periphery, and a lot of it was our inspiration for writing the book. We didn't plan on writing a book like when we set out, for sure, um, but we were trying to just make sense of what was happening in the city. I moved there in 2013. I think Phil was there a little bit earlier than me, right with the emergency management when James Craig, the head of the police department, was launching all these paramilitary raids, and we had some friends that were caught up in these paramilitary raids. And then they're starting to turn the water off, and then at the same time, there's all this kind of boosterism or excitement about what's happening downtown. They're calling it the greatest turnaround story in the 21st century in American history, and we're trying to just figure out how can we square this. And then at first we were thinking, well, maybe if we go back to the 1970s or if we go back to the 1980s, because neoliberalism was kind of a hot term in the academic community. So we thought maybe if we went back then, we could maybe make some sense of what was going on in the history of the city. But the further back we went, the more we realized that there's just a lot of myths around the city's history. So nothing we expected when we went further back really confirmed what we thought. Like we thought the post-war era was going to be this really um, expansive time, this really prosperous time, and then we realized that that was really not the case. There was an incredible amount of economic instability, unemployment, worker struggles, and then if you go back to the post World War One, mid 1910s, when Henry Ford is operating, we realized this was just we're in addition to the incredible amount of racial discrimination, racial violence, brutality from that angle, just the working class more generally, it was a brutal time in terms of both conditions inside the factory and life outside, and the way that political militants were treated. And Henry Ford is kind of like a lionized figure in the city, um, but we were realizing all of his Nazi connections, for instance, and just the way that he treated his workers, how disgustingly racist he was, how exploitative he was. And then we're kind of thinking, look, if we're going to tell this story to make sense of the present moment, all of this context is really necessary to figure out what is exactly going on, because a lot of the language of, oh, this is a return to the glory days, we're kind of thinking, like, what glory days exactly are you talking about, and who's that going to benefit? So yeah.
So, what brought you to the idea? Oh, go ahead, Philip.
Yeah. As to like the origin of the project, um, I would just add like me and Mark, both working for City Year when we first moved to Detroit.
Right.
We were both like volunteering or working at high schools in Detroit full time in like 2012, 2013. And so, we were like seeing a lot of the issues, around uh, throughout like the neighborhoods in Detroit, and at the same time, seeing all this rhetoric about the comeback downtown. And so that kind of like juxtaposition um, was like really stark, for us. And so we were basically just trying to figure that out. And I would also say like that time was an interesting time. Like 2012, I think was, because there have been these sort of efforts at like redevelopment since at least since like the rebellion years, like the post-rebellion years. Um, but at that time, like 2012, 2013, it kind of seemed like, things were like turning a corner, like investments were like still happening and happening. So, um, yeah, I think it was like that was a really interesting time to like be seeing those like efforts at reinvestment that have been happening for like 40 years starting to like really come to fruition at that time. And then we were also just like reading a bunch of like philosophy and theory and stuff. And basically we were seeing like all the things that we were reading like playing out uh, in like what we were seeing happening in the city. So yeah, that's kind of how it started.
It's, it started in such an interesting way to me because you have brought together the real, to me, a very important meaning of higher education and then life experience and then a continued curiosity as to how your life experience matches up with your knowledge and your education. So, uh, as I looked through the book today, I saw on nearly every page something that was familiar to me. And that is uh, quite magical for me because books frequently will take you other places, but when they take you to yourself, they have a very rich meaning. Many times, as I looked quickly through the book today, because they just arrived late this afternoon, and we were bundling up books and looking at it at the same time, um, I felt that so much of what I knew about was reflected, but it's so much of what my experience wasn't necessarily reflected, my personal experience, which is okay. And so, um, uh, what uh, do you mean in your introduction by Marx in Detroit?
Um, well, there's an essay that we actually found out fairly late in the process of writing this book by this Italian Marxist philosopher, Tronti, and he's trying to say basically, while there's a big Marxist influence in Europe and South America and Africa, and maybe less of Marx is maybe less in the culture in the United States. He's saying if you look closely at what's happening inside of the factories in Detroit, you're going to get a pretty close picture of what Marx is talking about in Capital and Grundrisse and other works like that. Um, so Marx in Detroit was just our way of drawing our attention to the fact that, like, you know, we're coming at it from a Marxist perspective, and not that we're just dogmatic and accepting everything that Marx is saying is true or accepting everything that Marxists in the history is true, but just trying to come at it from that perspective. Because while we're super, appreciative of a lot of the other critical histories, and we learned uh, our beginnings of our orientation was from books like Thomas Sugru and others, we didn't really feel that they were critical of that all of the events that they were happening, housing discrimination, racial discrimination, political uprisings, harsh working conditions, they weren't necessarily contextualizing that within this broader history of what's happening in terms of global capitalism. And we thought the more that we looked at it from that perspective, the more it really illuminated certain things, at least for us, and hopefully for others, and that we can see a real thread running through the city's history, which is that there's people in power at the top who have the tremendous amount of wealth, who have tremendous amount of control over the media and have a tremendous amount of control over how people spend their day-to-day life. And they've also have a tremendous amount of control over the police department in the way that they repress Black people, unemployed people, political militants, and that's really a thread you're going to see running through the city's history, whether it's the 1950s when the city's apparently super wealthy, or the 1990s when the city's being castigated as one of the poorest places in the developed world. So we wanted to bring that Marxist orientation, at least to maybe start the conversation, to bring it back to surface and draw attention to groups like the League of Revolution.
Revolutionary workers.
Black consciously and still consciously working in a Marxist tradition. And I think a lot of what they have to say really, at least to us, was super illuminating and continues to be illuminating. And we felt they had a great analysis of the 60s, but also the water shutoffs, like Marion Kramer and people like this are really very astute and very inspiring in the way they're looking at what's happening.
Well, I certainly appreciate that because Detroit has a strong history of of this tradition in Detroit. And for many years, we had people who were members of the Communist Party when it was legal, of course. And we've had a strong thread of very thoughtful, knowledgeable people. I know there's some in the audience today who can remember the time when there was not a nice way of thinking about this through our government. And then, in fact, we have a book in the store by David Marinas, who talks about his father and his uncle, along with Coleman Young, was brought up before the House Un-American Activities Committee to be questioned about their work as journalists, as politicians, and as you say, political radicals and political theorists. So thank you for doing that. I thought that was a very bold step on your part. Phil, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the Marxist framework is really appropriate for Detroit exactly because of what you're saying, which is that since like the early years of the UAW, this has been like a hugely important tradition in political organizing, labor organizing in the city. Um, so yeah, it's not only we not only found it to be like a useful analytical tool to like understand the stuff we were reading about, the history, but also um, yeah, like it's hard to ignore that to ignore like Marxist politics when you're looking at the city's history.
Well, thank you very much. I have another question for you. There's a lot of spin around the bankruptcy. What I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts about it, and how does this book approach the issue of the bankruptcy?
Um, yeah, the bankruptcy honestly is like um, a huge kind of like turning point, like in the recent history of the city. There's been a lot written about it and stuff. I think like um, the main thing that we're bringing to it to the analysis of it that's new is a lot of like the kind of like rhetoric you hear around the bankruptcy is like talking about like municipal mismanagement and certainly like there's like a lot you can point to corruption and stuff in Detroit's government but our take on it is kind of like it's basically you know you see austerity measures happening like throughout like from like at least from the 1980s you're seeing like public funding being cut the municipal workforce being like is cut in half I think from like the 1990s to like the early 2000s so you're already seeing like a lot of like these uh, trimming the budget and all this stuff, like coming leading up to the bankruptcy. And our thing is kind of like, this isn't like it's not like an aberration, and it's not an issue of like, oh, inflated like the inflated city budgets or city workforce, but it's just like more of a natural like progression from the history of like basically corporations having their way in the city. Essentially.
Yeah. I would just to pick off where Phil's saying, it's like it's pretty disgusting when you see not only the way like the New York Times or the Economist or like huge national outlets talk about it, but even the way that like Kevin Orr or the former mayor Bing discuss the bankruptcy. They say, "Oh, we were lazy, we were overfed, we got complacent," and it's to us. It's, do you realize you're describing what's considered the largest poor city in the U.S. that's gone under austerity measures for 40 years, where there's an incredibly high rate of unemployment, where they're turning off uh, water, where they're shutting schools, where they've been so destroyed by the foreclosure crisis, which people like Gilbert played a hand in facilitating and profiting from. So it's really, on one level, like what Phil's saying, it's kind of deplorable and morally unsettling to see this kind of narrative take hold in supposedly liberal outlets. But at the same time, exactly what Phil's saying, if you look at the history of the city from a long period of time, the fact that the city was declared bankrupt by an emergency manager who wasn't elected by the people, it's not an aberration in the city's history. Detroit hasn't had. Why is their public funds not sufficient? It's not sufficient because of the way that corporate elites and really powerful people in the federal government have affected the access to money that the city has. So I think it's Scott Kurashige, who we kind of riff off of in some of our book. I think he called it a financial coup, and I think that's fairly accurate, especially something that he pointed out and that we echo in our book is, if you look at what's happening in the reason why a Marxist approach is attractive is because if you look at it just from the perspective of Detroit, you don't see that this very similar things are happening around the world, driven by very similar dynamics and in very, very obvious ways that you don't need a PhD like we're pursuing to see. Like the same, like Judge Rhodes is facilitating the bankruptcy in Detroit, and then he's shipped off to Puerto Rico to facilitate the bankruptcy in Puerto Rico. It's
Exactly.
deplorable history, and the fact that people are cheerleading the process, like The Economist, either means that they're so corrupt and they're so happy that rich people are getting rich in the city again, or that they just are completely unaware of the city's history. And that's something we try to correct. Not that other people haven't been writing about it, like Phil's saying. There's a lot of critical voices about the bankruptcy. We just wanted to kind of reflect that and draw attention to the activist work.
Saying that again, you got close to the next thing I was going to ask you about the threads that are running from, is it 1913 when you began through today? Why did you pick 1913? What made you pick that? I'm sure it was intentional. You can jump in.
Well, I'll take it if Phil's not going to take it.
Well, you have to
That's
think. It takes time to think a little bit. I know. It's okay.
That's true. That's true. You know, uh, 1913 is a really pivotal. I think Phil wrote this part in the introduction where I believe where it's just, it is somewhat an arbitrary point in the sense that you have to start somewhere. We were like, the further we thought we would go back and say, oh, okay, now we can start from like Thomas Sugru. Let's just start in the post-war era, and then from there we'll tell this story about what's happening about the Great Rebellion in his book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis. And of course, you can start there, but you miss a tremendous amount of context for the amount of exploitation and the organizing that comes before. So in a certain sense, like Herb Boyd just wrote a history of history of the African American experience in Detroit. He went way back. He went back centuries, and we weren't prepared to do that. So 1913. Insofar as it's a Marxist history, that's when Henry Ford really gets going. That's around the time he introduces the $5 day. That's the time the international workers of the world are really starting to rile workers up in their own militant fashion. And we thought that was a good time to start, just insofar as the fact that I'm surprised that other histories haven't drawn the attention to just how terrible morally a person Henry Ford is, and how brutal the work conditions and how shoddy the pay was inside of the factories. And that's, I think, a really important part of the story, especially Phil again wrote this in the book, Ford Field, Ford Freeway, the Ford Museum. And then, something I was thinking about recently is there's an incredible amount of protests happening around the country, I think rightfully so, at all of these Confederate monuments that are peppered throughout the U.S. South. but I never really saw it questioned that much in the public sphere. The fact that Detroit is basically named after Henry Ford, who had a gushing personal correspondence with Adolf Hitler, and his racism was not limited to the Jews. He was racist against Asian Americans. He was racist in the most deplorable ways against African Americans. But his racism aside, if you look at just how him and the other auto companies exploited the workers in the factories in the early 1900s, you can't reflect back like Donald Trump is saying, let's make America great again. So what are you talking about? You know, how many people are dying inside the plant? How many people are being repressed? How many people are? It's a really disgusting history, but also necessary to contextualize. I think, like Phil, again, I'm just, drawing attention to stuff he's written. Like when you look at the purchase of the Michigan Michigan Central train station, and Ford's buying that and saying, oh, like we're gonna be great, like Fords have been there for the city and everything. It's like, what history are you really referring to? So maybe Phil could take it from there.
Well, I paused for a second because I was like, why did we start there? And I think we wrote it, and then we were like, oh, what's like the earliest date that we talk about? I think it was 1913, but 1913 was also the year that Henry Ford opened the Model T factory in Highland Park, the Crystal Palace factory, which was kind of like when he like really got going with like mass production. And speaking of like threads through the history of Detroit, it's interesting because his plant before that was on Piquette in Detroit, and then he moved out to Highland Park, which at the time was like a rural community. It was like, and it was outside the city limits. Only after like I think many years subsequent to that did Detroit like expand and grow beyond and like end up consuming, like going around Highland Park. For non-Detroiters listening, if there are any, Highland Park is a separate city, but it's totally within Detroit. Anyway, so basically, people talk about like suburbanization and deindustrialization starting like after World War II, when like factories were moving like to the suburbs, factories were moving to like California, to like the West, and then subsequently like moving, across the world. But this like sort of drive to like leave to bring manufacturing out of the city started like back then in 1913. Like what's considered kind of like the beginning of industrialization was already like the beginning of the deindustrialization of the city of Detroit, because he's like moving out, he's like moving to the farmland. And then, when did he open River Rouge? Like the 30s, I think, or maybe anyway. But then after Highland Park, he moved to like River Rouge, the River Rouge factory in Dearborn. Like he's always trying to get like farther out. And of course there were factories in Detroit. I mean, there still are, but we could, as we like look back, we could see this trend of suburbanization, deindustrialization happening like way at the beginning. So I think that's another like sort of
Did we lose him? Okay. I thought we lost for a moment there.
Oh,
Okay. Well, thank you very much. The history is really deep and rich. Philip, was it you that worked at it was in Hamtramck and worked at the not Four Seasons, the Seasons restaurant in Royal Oak?
yeah.
Yeah, you're the one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was working at In Season throughout
In
the
season,
whole
right.
writing of the book. Shout out.
Yeah, shout out.
Out there.
Right.
Bussing your table.
Yeah, it could have.
I
It's
washed the dishes
possible.
for a time as
You
well.
did,
Yeah,
okay.
Mark also worked there
Right.
briefly. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I was living in Hamtramck.
Hmm. So when
Yeah,
we were talking about Highland Park, Hamtramck is another one of those small
yeah.
places where it's really surrounded also now by Detroit's boundaries, and it was a place where people worked very hard in the factories, and it was a place of a great mixture of people.
Hmm.
Frequently,
Hmm.
people think of Hamtramck as being a place where Polish people lived, but prior to that, and alongside of that, there was a big African American population.
Mm.
So much so that the baseball field for the Black League, the Detroit Stars, I think, was there
Hmm.
in Hamtramck and is currently under some rehabilitation to make the park, bring the ballpark back again. So,
Yeah, yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think I know that like the soccer team.
It stopped again. It stopped again.
Always used to
Uh,
walk park there. Yeah.
okay. I think we're having a little technical things going on here, but we're going to press right on. Um, So in the book, as I said today, I was flipping through the book quickly and I saw names. Uh, uh, Kenneth Cockrel. How did he come into your mind, and how did he generate thinking on your part? And what is he contributing to the book for us?
Well, he's just very quotable. I don't know if people are familiar with his speaking, but he's very easy to quote. It was like anytime we like needed something punchy to say, it's like, what did Kenneth Cockrell have to say about this?
Mhm, mhm,
um, but yeah, I mean, um, obviously, yeah, he played a huge role in like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers.
mhm,
He was a lawyer, and he was like really pivotal in some court cases.
mhm.
Um,
Fairground
especially
Council.
the James Johnson court case where this worker at the Eldon Avenue plant,
Mhm,
um, black worker came in one day. He was a Vietnam vet and he had been working there, and he came in and one day at work he came in and he killed two white foremen and a coworker, I think.
Yeah.
And because his like working conditions were so bad, and he was being like abused by his foreman and stuff on the job.
mhm,
And then Kenneth Cockle defended him, and he says, "We're going to put Chrysler on trial for damages to this man from his working conditions." And he won the case, and James Johnson got off and was paid $75 a week in back pay, I think, from Chrysler.
mhm,
And there's like a lot of anecdotes about like involving Kenneth Cockrell. And he was like a city council member
mhm,
in like the late 70s, early 80s. And there's a couple of great films that we saw. Well, finally got the news, which is on the League of Revolutionary Black Workers from 1970. And then there's another one called Taking Back Detroit.
mhm.
That's from 1980. Both another documentary, and that one's really interesting because that was a time when there was like a huge construction boom downtown, like in the around like the late 70s. And it's very similar to like what you see happening today. And there's all this footage of Ken Cockrell, um, like at city council meetings and stuff, and it's like they're voting on these developments on like very similar to what's happening today, like tax breaks and subsidies for these developments. And there's like they're voting, and everyone's raising their hand, yes. And then it's like pans around to Kenneth Cockrell. All right, now it's just him. He was there. He was there. Throughout a lot of that history, even beyond like the League, which a lot of people are familiar with. And yeah, he just had a lot to say, and we found his analysis to be, we basically, in large part, like followed what he and other kind of like activists and politicians were saying, while these events were happening.
Well, of course, he was very well regarded in the community and thought of as intellectual as well. I want to go to one more personality, and then if we have any questions in the chat, we'll take them. Uh, Coleman Young.
Okay, Coleman Young.
Yes, Coleman
Um,
Young.
well,
More
Coleman Young,
difficult one.
yeah, Coleman Young is good to put off with to pair with Kenneth Cockrel, especially because when Kenneth died, there was a lot of talk that he was going to be running for mayor in the late 80s, and according to the literature and the people that we interviewed, the people thought that he would have a good chance of winning against Coleman Young, who by that time had really abandoned his communist leanings or really sympathy with the poor more generally in terms of his policy procedures. Coleman Young, super interesting figure in terms of his former communist background, his like rich history of activism during the 50s and the 60s, and obviously the election in 1973 that he wins. And it's a momentous moment for the city's history generally and African American history within the city more particularly. And Coleman Young, in at least a lot of current day coverage of the city, either gets a superficial reading as sort of just like a hero of the African American population, or in publications like the National Liberal Press, they'll say, "Oh, he's corrupt. Oh, he was too liberal. Oh, the Coleman Young years are really the time when the decadence began, and that's why we had to sort of bail them out." Or not bail them out. That's why we had to create this bankruptcy. So what we were basically saying is actually, if you look at just what Coleman Young was doing in the context of global capitalism in the 1970s, we just basically say his options for operating are pretty narrow if he wants to keep within the confines of soliciting investment, because the federal government is really abandoning the city. White people are fleeing along with the factories. And it's very interesting. Coleman Young comes in and he says, to all the criminals, hit 8 Mile Road. And then he says something along the lines of, we're against criminals, but we also recognize that crime is rooted in economic issues. And then by the late 70s, it's very apparent that he doesn't have the funds nor necessarily the will to address those economic issues. So Coleman Young is very, very early on taking a very hardline stance against criminals, whereas the more national discussion in like leftist circles tends to revolve around Michelle Alexander's really important work, The New Jim Crow. But if you look at if you look at more closely at what's happening in Detroit, there are white governors and there are white people in City Hall and white capitalists, but at the same time, the punitive turn and really harsh policing measures is supported by people like Coleman Young. It's supported by a majority African American city council and by a black middle class. That's just bared out in the voting history and the protests that were being led. And Coleman Young was, I think that the activists that we talked to who were operative during that time period were very happy that Coleman Young got rid of stress, the brutal policing program. But they were sort of saying after that, we were very happy to have a black mayor. At the same time, Coleman Young really cozied up to corporations very, very quickly. And unlike the 40s and 50s, those corporations weren't really prepared to stick around. So very early, he's just trying to do exactly what Mayor Duggan is trying to do, shift public funds from social services to luring in and subsidizing investment downtown. And we don't think that's necessarily because he's corrupt or because he's an evil person or because he's a sellout. It's more just that's what all the mayors were doing around the country at that time period, because that was the conditions of global capitalism. And so if you wanted to play the game, that was the game, unfortunately.
Philip, you want to add?
Well, I think, what like Coleman Young is dealing with a lot of like what mayors in cities across the country are dealing with. And I think like one thing that sets Coleman Young apart is like his very long tenure as mayor. You know, he was mayor for 20 years, 1974 to 1994. And, you know, that kind of coincides with what people think of as like the decline of Detroit. So you know, he's kind of just been associated with those years. Like, well, Coleman Young was mayor during those years, so it must be Coleman Young who like tanked the city. And obviously, there's a lot of, you know, uh, kind of racist feelings about that. You know, this is when like a lot of white people were leaving the city, and you know, people are like, oh, well, look what happens when you know, you let African Americans take over. But you know, you can see it's like the context, and it's the kind of things that were happening in cities across the country. And I think in large part, Coleman Young just happened to be there for like the entire kind of duration of those things happening. So, you know, I think he's a much more complex like figure than he's usually painted, at least in like mainstream kind of like, you know, journalism and this kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it, just the fact that he was mayor for such a long time during such a difficult period of the history.
And interestingly enough, he was a senator for the state of Michigan before that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So for those of you who are in our virtual audience, if you have questions, just put them into the chat. If not, we will just keep on going. So let me say this to you. You are two young men who've done a remarkable research and study on the long and complex history of Detroit. I'm a native Detroiter. My parents, I realized with the work of Isabel Wilkerson in her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, that my parents were actually part of the Great Migration. I never thought of them like that, but they did come from the South after their college years to Detroit. And as a result, myself and my siblings were born here in the city. And so I kind of have a long relationship with them as well, at that time as well. So I want to know, as two young white fellas who are working in the academy, what has this research done for you and your thinking, and what do you hope to give to those people who read your work and who follow the train of thinking that you have? What did you get, and how are you projecting on with this? Philip, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, first, Mark had started his like graduate school in like 2015 or something, I think.
Yeah.
But when we were working on the book, I wasn't in the academy yet. I just started here at Santa Cruz in this PhD program in the fall. And you know, we had both been living there Mark had lived there for a few years before he started his program. But for me, you know, it was like living in the city during that time was like really the biggest kind of influence, you know, on why I wanted to work on this, and just seeing what was happening, you know, watching like the stadium being built on Woodward, you know, the new hockey stadium being built there, while, you know, we're hearing about these like police raids in poor neighborhoods where they're finding like a couple grams of weed and they had to let everyone go, and the media is like, yeah, thanks for cracking down on crime. And meanwhile, you know, they're giving away $300 million to build this stadium there, which they took money from the schools to like subsidize the stadium. And you know, I think Mark and I were both just kind of like, how, like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I mean, yeah, so it was just you know, it was like just a powerful thing to be living through and kind of trying to understand that. And I think, you know, for me, what I feel like I want people to take away from the book is, it is nice, I think, for a lot of people to see the kind of changes, the developments that are happening. I mean, my partner and I, we would go to, like, they would have movies playing in the park in New Center, and you see all these families like going to see movies outside, and it's like, this is amazing, this is great, this wouldn't have been happening probably 10 years ago. And a lot of, like, what you hear from residents and stuff is they're like, if gentrification is like the roads not being icy during the winter, and if gentrification is like having something, having like police respond quicker, then that's like, I have gentrification. But I think what we're really trying to point out is like that whatever good is happening downtown and midtown and all these places has to be seen in the context of the full history of the city, and that these kinds of like positive developments that are happening right now are directly tied to things like the cuts in public spending that we're talking about, cuts in the municipal workforce, stuff like the foreclosure crisis, and the way that the city and the county handles like delinquent taxes, and like repossessing homes and stuff. Like, you see the very neighborhoods where these kinds of things were happening that are now the ones being hailed as like examples of the good of development. So I think we're really just trying to make people see like that the unity of these processes, and then to point to like all these radical politicians that we found like throughout the history saying who are trying to fight against this. And so we're trying to like also just bring out those voices, because as you say, we're a couple of young white guys who moved to Detroit after college. We don't think that we have all the answers, but we're just trying to like point to some of the things that we found, and to try to bring in these voices that we found throughout the history that we weren't hearing before this.
And surely trying to understand. I can really appreciate that from you, to be able to try to understand what's going on. And I can assure you that there are many people in the city of Detroit who have a long history here, and those who are in other places too, who have an understanding, and it's a deep understanding of experience as well as their own decision as to what's really going on. And it usually breaks down to, well, there they go again, or that's we know what that's all about. So it's sort of resigning oneself to that. And then that'll lead me to one more thing, and we're getting close to our hour. We're in the middle of this huge world shutdown. The pandemic has done things for communities and people and neighborhoods and groups that nothing else could have been done. I heard a conversation with, I think her name is Abramson, who writes for the Atlantic, in an article, and she said uh, America has always thought itself as being exceptional and the greatest and all of those things. But it's taken a pandemic to call the question. So, in our final few minutes, what have you to say about the experience with the pandemic and the shutdown that's happening, and the possible um, uh, growth that we might see in the future? For example, my thought is that some of the things that the progressive minds have wanted for a long time, maybe this is the time when we can get some of those things done. So, your thoughts?
I think our, our thoughts on the virus immediately led us to draw some parallels with working conditions in the city in the past. I think that, we had two thoughts of it. We were talking about it and writing some stuff about it earlier. One is if you look at the strikes that the bus drivers were going under and the Amazon workers strikes, and they're saying, look, our bosses don't really care about our health conditions. They're making us work amidst this pandemic. Of course, that's new in the sense that it's brought by an external force, the virus. But at the same time, if you look at the city's history, you see workplace deaths and workplace illnesses is nothing new. And then we're looking. There's a famous study that took place in the early 70s that basically said that 16,000 people are dying in U.S. factories every year, and that more people are dying inside U.S. factories during the Vietnam War than were dying in the Vietnam War. So people dying inside U.S. factories are people facing up to callous bosses that don't really care that much about their workers' safety as long as the work gets done is nothing particularly new in the city, especially if you go back to Ford's days. People are just dying in the factory with no compensation. But then more significantly, there's a huge process of austerity cutbacks that's happened in the last 30 years to public welfare and to the public health department and to the police department in terms of emergency response. And it's not really a natural disaster or just a crisis. These are really affected by these processes. They just made a tremendous amount of cuts to the healthcare system, starting, in the mid 2000s. So this crisis is really being exacerbated by a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about and that activists are talking about. Or you're saying just residents generally have just know, okay, here it comes. There's a sort of apathy by the people that are running the city or lack of regard. And in terms of there being any positive that might come from it, that would be terrific, especially in terms of, like in New York, a lot of people are saying, well, we can't come up with our rent. There's a $1,200 stimulus. How are we supposed to come up with our rent? And then it's maybe leading a lot of people. There are a lot of activists that are saying, well, how come we really have to pay the rent in the first place? We live here. It's not like the landlords are doing anything. How about a system where just the maintenance happens in a nonprofit way? So there are conversations, and we were talking to a hip hop artist, One Below, who's prominent in the community as well, and he's saying, yeah, you still have to pay for Netflix. If you're even in a comfortable enough position to be watching Netflix, you still have to pay for internet. And he's saying, well, maybe people will start asking questions. Well, why is this the case? But I think something that we really draw attention to in the book, and that Phil did a really good job of highlighting also, is like there's a big tradition in the city's history led by people like Grace Lee Boggs, who are very powerful in terms of their historical legacy and their activism, but are also extremely optimistic in the sense of the possibility for what people might do in terms of horizontal collaboration. And we just always try to make the point that, like, just as activists in the city are scheming, Dan Gilbert is also scheming, and he has a lot more money to scheme with and a lot more control. So that's why Marx's framework is nice, because it's a struggle. It's not just going to like, hey, we want free healthcare, and then Duggan's like, oh, great, yeah, let's do that. There's going to be a ton of resistance to any kind of social progress.
Philip, I'm going to add a question came in, or a comment from Bo Lucas. Thank you for bringing this in to talk about how Ford's automation impacted the future of labor and who benefits and who does not benefit from automation. Tie that up with our last question. Philip?
That's interesting, because the other thing about the coronavirus is also that it is leading also to a push towards more automation, and understandably, you can see why you would want to remove people from the production process right now, because you don't want them to get sick. But you also see that throughout the history, that automation is like rampant, and that's something that workers really fought against, because when automation happens, generally what happens is a bunch of people get laid off, and the people who are left working have to work twice as hard because they're trying to keep up with a machine. And I still think the best analysis of automation is Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. I'll revisit that, the assembly line scene.
Yeah.
says all you need to know, and then they you know, the boss tries to bring in a machine so that he can eat while he's still on the assembly line working. And that's basically that's the same logic that's still kind of driving these things. You know, it's about trying to you know make production cheaper by removing the human element and trying to work people even harder. And so with coronavirus, you know, again, it's like just exacerbating a lot of the trends that you're already seeing in the history of Detroit, and automation is another example of that. Yeah.
Um,
Thanks, Mr. Lucas, for
yeah.
your question.
Yes. Yes. I'm going to hold the book up in front of my face. I don't know if anybody can see it, but this is the book, A People's History of Detroit. And I love the. Oh, you've got it right there. Good. 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 And so.
You gave me one too.
Yeah. Good. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been a very interesting discussion. I really admire your tenacity and working hard to uncover the deep and rich history of Detroit, and also the devilishness of the history, and it has had its impact on people across ethnic lines and across neighborhoods. I have to say that there were neighborhoods where African American people lived who weren't touched in the same way that they're being touched today. I grew up on the old West Side, and we were in. It was a de facto segregation, and we were insulated from so much. Now that I am old and know that, but we were cared for by our neighbors, our churches, our young people's groups. There was so we could go to any church, in and out of all the churches that had programs for young people, the Ys and the YWCA. Even though they were segregated, we had great direction and guidance from those kinds of organizations. So, in spite of it all, many people grew up and grew up well in Detroit and learned to live well. And I often say to young people that come in the store who I say, well, what should I do? What should I do? I said, well, find your spot, put down your roots, and live well. Because all of these things continue to happen over and over again in the world. And so I want to thank you again for being here. I want to thank my daughter, Allison Jones Turner, and her husband, Kenneth Turner, for being the background to this. They always put me out front. I don't know why. Put me out front, but they're doing all this work. And any glitches that our audience might have seen during this inaugural event of our Friday night dates, we hope to get them fixed and better by the next time. And it may be that we can even someday have you guys in the store really ready. We'd
That
love,
would be
love,
awesome.
love, love to have you. Thank you, audience, virtual audience, for being here. Thank you, Philip and Mark, for being here. And continue good work. Continue with your efforts. And hopefully, we'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.